Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. So my name's Corin Eggleston, and I'm Deputy Head of Research at Learning and Work Institute, and I've overseen this piece of research. So for people who don't know, the Learning and Work Institute is an independent policy and research organisation focused on lifelong learning and better work. And this webinar builds on research that L&W has recently conducted, supported and funded by Pearson. The work's looked into the development and use of occupational standards. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, occupational standards outline the knowledge, skills and behaviours needed to be occupationally competent in particular roles. They're the foundation for apprenticeships and other technical qualifications, but they can also be used by employers across a range of sectors and by educational institutions, training providers, qualification setting organisations, awarding bodies to support learners to develop the vocational skills needed for job roles. So our research looked into the development and use of occupational standards and whether this is keeping pace with the changing needs of the economy. So this webinar aims to consider the findings from this research and to explore whether the current occupational standards system is agile enough to meet the government's mission for growth and to sustain the fast-paced change required in the key IS8 sectors that are the core of the government's industrial strategy. So sectors such as digital technology and advanced manufacturing, those where there's rapid technological change. I'm shortly going to pass on to my colleague Danny, who's going to give a brief overview of our research and some of the key findings and considerations. We were going to also be joined by my colleague Hazel, but unfortunately she's having some technical difficulties, so she might appear through the presentation, but I think Danny will most likely cover all of it. The rest of the webinar will then focus on a panel discussion and audience Q&A. So before I pass over to Danny, I just wanted to thank Pearson for funding and supporting this work and to all of the research participants who took part in it. So we talked to a wide range of different stakeholders, including awarding bodies, training providers, policymakers, root panel members and employers, and it's really their insights which enabled us to complete the research. Could I also ask you to post questions for the discussion using the Q&A function? So it'd be great to have as many questions as possible from the audience. And if you could start posting those now, that would be wonderful. These questions will be fed through to me so that I can then put them to the panel. Finally, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and we'll distribute the recording to everyone who's registered to the webinar afterwards. So that's it from me to start with. So I'll pass over to Danny to present the key findings from the research.
Thanks very much, Corin. So to start with, I'm going to kick off with the aims of the project, the approach we took, and then the key outputs before talking through the key findings and considerations. So could I get the next slide, please, Helen? Thank you. So earlier this year, as Corin mentioned, L&W were commissioned by Pearson to conduct research into the development and use of occupational standards. The research explored if the current development and use of occupational standards are keeping change with the needs of the economy, and then how we can better develop and use occupational standards to ensure they're fit for purpose. Just to note before we begin, this research focuses on England and Skills England, formerly IFATE standards, rather than the national occupational standards which were used in England prior to 2017 and continue to operate in the devolved nations. Can I get the next slide, please? So research activities took place in spring and summer of this year and included a rapid review of existing evidence on the development and use of occupational standards, a review of international best practice, and then qualitative interviews with 20 skills system stakeholders. So this included policy stakeholders, awarding bodies, training providers, representative bodies, employers, and then root panel members. So based on the desk-based activities, we produced a literature review of existing evidence which included additional case studies on the Nesta skills taxonomy in the UK, ONET in the USA, and best practice from the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Germany. And then overall, the key output from this work is a final report, which will be launched today. Next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm now going to talk through some of the key findings and considerations for designing and using occupational standards identified in our research. And I've kind of broken these down into a finding and then related consideration. So firstly, we found that stakeholders feel occupational standards take too long to develop. This does vary by sector, but our research showed kind of a range of 6 months to 2 years to develop a new standard. And generally, while stakeholders recognize the importance of having a rigorous process, it was felt to be a lengthy and overly bureaucratic process, which can leave qualifications in fast-moving sectors out of date and kind of undermine the ability of the skills system to meet learner and industry needs. The length of the process, particularly to root panel members, was also felt to be burdensome. Root panel members and trailblazer groups, sorry. So as a consideration to overcome this, we think Skills England could learn from international good practice we found during our desk research. So for example, they could develop a fast track system where research resources are focused on key changes. They could implement time limits on each stage, or also use data-driven approaches. So for example, data that could signify if a standard needs amending, or data to be used to rapidly collect insights from employers into kind of necessary changes. Then we also found that small groups of often larger employers tend to have a disproportionate influence in shaping standards. And this was generally a result of them having more resources to commit to the process. And as a result of this, we found that standards are typically less representative, not typically, but they can be less representative of the sector more widely. So to overcome this, Skills England could look at ways to engage SMEs, engage their views more comprehensively. This could include seeking input from employer representative groups who could reflect their consensus view, setting quotas around the involvement of SMEs in trailblazer groups and root panels, further kind of incentivizing their involvement in some way, or finally developing surveys which could reduce the burden of direct involvement while still gauging their views. Could I get the next slide, please, Helen? Thank you. So from our research, we found 2 key challenges in the development of occupational standards. So firstly, that of striking the balance between breadth, so that standards are usable by whole sectors, but also that they include sufficient detail to meet individual employer skills needs. And then also similarly, another balance between being sufficiently stable so that they have legacy value for end users, but also that they're responsive to emerging technological changes so that they remain relevant as these changes occur. And we found that one way to potentially solve both of these issues is to structure standards in a kind of layered way, with a stable core and additional elements adding specificity. This can ensure that they have sufficient breadth at the top level to equip workers for a cluster of occupations, say, with additional flexibility added for specific roles with the kind of more specific layers. This structure would also allow them to be changed quickly and more frequently in response to technological change, with the core remaining stable and additional elements undergoing quicker revision. Could I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So in general, stakeholders agreed that there's currently too many IFA or Skills England standards at over 670. And it was felt that this makes for a quite confusing and complex system in which there's kind of significant overlap between standards and some standards that serve a very small number of employers. And we know that this is something that Skills England are aware of and are already looking to resolve by amalgamating and retiring standards, while also looking to develop fewer new standards. From our desk research, this is something that the size of the number of standards, sorry, is something that they could reference other countries for as a sort of benchmark. As the next point, we found that there could be considerable variation in the quality and content of standards, with inconsistent language and formatting used in the drafting of knowledge, skills, and behaviors across sectors. And this limits the ability for workers and other stakeholders to identify transferable skills that would allow them to move between roles and also seek additional relevant training to progress in their careers. So this could be overcome by project managers following consistent processes in the development of standards across different sectors, while transferability could also be improved by stakeholders drafting common sets of knowledge, skills, and behaviors where relevant across sectors and making clear where there are commonalities to users. And then also continuing to use the cross-route frameworks, which are referenced in our report, in embedding skills that are fundamental to all or many sectors in a structured and consistent way. For example, our report references the Green Skills Toolkit and Digital Skills Framework, which are currently being added to standards. Could I get the next slide, please? So we also found that stakeholders had mixed views on the quality of communications received around the development and review of standards, with a handful of stakeholders referencing a lack of transparency. This points to a need for Skills England to adopt a more consistent and prompt approach to communicating the nature and timings of standard review and revision, with stakeholders allowing them time to prepare. And then finally, it was felt that occupational standards could be used more widely. So where they're currently primarily used in the development of apprenticeships and other accredited training, stakeholders suggested that they could also be used in things like drafting job descriptions, workforce planning, and then in developing non-accredited training. And building on this, Skills England could look to encourage and support employers to use standards in these ways, which could also contribute to more occupational consistency in roles at higher levels. I think that's the end of my section.
Thanks, Danny. There was a question in the slides just about a question in the Q&A just about whether we'll share the slides, and yes, we'll share that alongside the recording with everyone who's registered. So now we're moving on to the panel discussion. So if I could just introduce our panel. So we have Carmel Grant, Deputy Director, Development and Innovation at Skills England, Donna Ford Clark, Vice President of Vocational Qualifications and Portfolio at Pearson, Stephen Evans, Chief Executive at Learning Work Institute, Philip Bryant, Skills and Standards Manager at Energy and Utility Skills, Claire Aspinall, Impact and Delivery Manager at Ingenuity, and Emily Stubbs, Head of Policy at Chambers of Commerce, Greater Birmingham. So if I could ask you all to join, perfect. So we're just going to start with a kick-off question for everyone, well, for each of you, and then we'll move into the audience Q&A. So again, if people can send in any questions either for the panel in general or for specific members using the Q&A function, that would be great. So if we could start with you, Carmel. Could I ask you what the key areas are that Skills England are currently focusing on to ensure that standards are fit for purpose and keep pace with the changing needs of the economy?
Yeah, thank you, Corin. Can you hear me all right? Not used to using Zoom, so just making sure you can hear me. And thank you for inviting me. Yeah, so Afternoon, everybody. I can't see who's joined us, so forgive me if you already know quite a lot about Skills England, but Skills England was formed out of the original Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. So we're carrying forward the work as well as expanding our remit in Skills England. And in terms of the areas that Skills England is focusing on, it won't be a surprise to people that we're particularly looking around the industrial strategy, opportunities, the growth areas, we're working with a wider range of stakeholders, including regionally based as well as national based stakeholders, to bring in more insights into future standard development. And it's probably worth highlighting that our occupational standards, as well as being the basis for apprenticeships, very much basis for qualifications as well, and they have been for some years. So we're looking particularly, say, around those industrial strategy areas, around those priority areas, in terms of either updating some of the standards or building in some new skills elements. And probably our focus as well has, as we grow as an organisation, has particularly developed into bringing in more data insights, which I think you flagged in your report. So looking at where we can bring more quickly some of the data, some of the insights, both from employers or providers, wherever the sources are. And you will I'm sure some colleagues on the call will have seen some of the reports that we've published. And so it's very much building on what we have done before, but looking more data informed where that's available, looking to prioritise where government departments and employers tell us there are particular skills needs or particular skills changes, whether they're immediate or in the future. And continuing to develop that, whether it be for apprenticeships, for qualifications, and I'm sure some of you are aware of the foundation apprenticeships and short courses work that we've been doing as well. Hopefully that helps give a sort of overview, Corinne, of where we currently are in our first 3 months of Skills England.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on to Donna from Pearson. So as an awarding body, what's the balance for you between making sure that occupational standards are stable versus enabling them to adapt to rapid changes in the economy?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I think this probably seems contradictory and probably impossible. We're trying to maintain the stability but have the flexibilities. But it goes to the heart of the 10 awarding organization face in terms of bring the credibility and the relevance of a qualification. Stability of standards underpins trust. When there's consistency, there is trust from centers, from employers, from learners. Constant changes undermine confidence and create challenges from a delivery point of view. Employers, educators, and learners need to have consistency to plan, deliver, and assess their learning. So multiple changes too quickly, too often creates chaos. On the other side, adaptability is essential for relevance. The world of work is changing rapidly. We mentioned AI and green skills, and digital transformation is completely changing the way we work, and therefore qualifications need to keep up. And if there isn't flexibility to make those changes, then the qualifications we offer risk becoming outdated and obsolete quite quickly. So the challenge is striking a balance. And how do we do that? And I think the report and what we heard from what you found, there's certainly some good ideas there in terms of how we do it. So I think first we do need to look at the design of occupational standards. We need to think about what they're doing in this moment in time. So where they started with apprenticeships and they were created for that purpose. Over time, they have changed and they've started to use for technical quals and other things. But the design is the same since 2017, when it started with apprenticeship. So we really do need to rethink the design of apprenticeship standards. We have seen an example from another region where they designed their standards where there's a foundational core that doesn't change often, and then there are elements that can change, and it's quite flexible. So we really need to think about how we're using the standards now and make sure the design of the standards work for what we do with them now, not 2017 where they started. I also think there's something about big data and AI. AI is transforming the way we work, and we've got to think about how we use big data and AI to be more agile and much quicker in terms of the development of standards. And I think finally, we do need to build flexibility into the process. There are times where we will need to have a standard quickly, and we can't go through the 6 months process or the 5 months process. We need to be able to have the flexibility in the system to do that. So it seems tough, but we have got to be able to find that balance between credibility and relevance, because we can't sacrifice one for the other. We've got to find where they can coexist well. So I think that's something that we're going to have to think about over the next few years, where we're thinking about skills and the skills landscape and the challenge from a reskilling and an upskilling point of view.
Thanks, Donna. So next, Stephen. So question to you is, does it look like we have too many occupational standards, or is our economy just more complicated than comparable countries such as Germany or Switzerland, who have less than half of the standards that we do?
Thanks, Corinne. Afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I think too many, too slow, too uncertain is basically the sort of the headlines from the research. So yeah, as you were saying, Corinne, as Danny was saying as well, we've got more than twice as many occupational standards as places like Germany and Switzerland, and our economy is definitely not twice as more than twice as complicated. So I think the slightly mad proliferation that we've had over the last 10 years doesn't help us, because you end up with lots of really niche stuff, and you end up with apprenticeships and qualifications that prepare people perhaps for just their current job and not their wider occupation, and don't give that flexibility and that future proofing. So the current situation as it's developed over the last 10 years is not helpful, and we need to significantly reduce the numbers. I guess what I picked up from those international examples as well was that other countries do these things quicker than us, oftentimes. And again, the kind of delays in the current process in England seem to be at every stage, and it kind of varies by standard. So sometimes it's a group of employees that can't agree at the start, and sometimes it's the Department for Education or the Department for Work and Pensions now, it turns out, slightly randomly as of yesterday, who sign these things off. So we kind of got delays along the way. And that's why I think that the two, as well as the numbers point that you're asking about, I think the point that really stands out to me is what Donna was talking about. So balancing standing the test of time versus a bit of flexibility. And that's the idea of, could you have a sort of core and then a bit that goes on top that varies a bit more, but also having a much clearer forward view and deadlines for each stage of the process. We have a kind of tracker at the moment, but it doesn't tell us that. It doesn't tell us when different standards are going to be reviewed. There's no time limits for different bits of the process, and things can kind of just go on forever if we're not careful. So I'd say definitely we've got way too many. We need to halve them, I would say, over the next few years. We'd probably say it's about where we started. And then be much clearer about that flexibility versus standing the test of time, and clear time limits for each stage of the process, so that we know what's going to happen and when, and things don't drag on.
Thanks, Stephen. So, Phil, coming to you, could I ask you a specific question about the energy sector? So, the government has big ambitions for clean energy by 2030, and lots of changes to our energy structure. Are the current occupational standards fit for purpose? Are there any specific examples you have in your work where they're not working well?
I would say that current standards, yes and no. There are some good practice out there and good examples, but there's definitely room for improvement and further work. One of the challenges that I think we will face with regard to this ambition, I note that this research and what we're talking about today, we're talking about standards in England and through Skills England. The government's ambitions for clean energy 2030 is a UK-wide ambition, and it's only going to be done through UK-wide standards and work and initiatives. And I think at the moment, what you'd probably notice is that there is inconsistency across the different four nations in terms of the standards that exist, and also, I suppose more importantly, the funded provision that exists across. And so achieving common, consistent standards and funded programs across the four nations is one aspect for us to consider. I think that across the industry sector, there is a growing awareness of the need to improve in terms of the standards that do exist, and also how well and we articulate what competency looks like. So the number of projects that we lead on to do this and to improve transitioning between roles and to articulate what competency looks like, especially when it comes to retraining of staff and for people transitioning between traditional energy roles and new or clean energy roles. And so understanding what that journey looks like, what skills are transferable, how you can take a traditional based workforce and deploy them on new and clean energy initiatives is critical. And there's a number of things like that which are ongoing. So we're heading in the right direction. I think obviously scale and the pace of change that's needed is a factor. I think there are estimates of something like 1 in 5 jobs are going to be affected by the transition to net zero. And so that is a significant proportion of the UK workforce that will need retraining and upskilling. And that retraining and upskilling has to be underpinned by industry-driven standards for it to be effective and for it to deliver meaningful output. I think that there's probably a need for more clarity around the different job roles that exist, because I think a lot of employers find it difficult to recruit people into roles. And so people's understanding as to what competency looks like, both from the employer point of view, but also the potential employee, and knowing what job opportunities are out there based on their current skill set. And I think this then feeds through into the other areas. So in terms of curriculum design, qualification provision and training provision, these are all areas that need to be aligned with a clear idea as to what standards looks like, and for us to be identifying what these priority roles are. So, making sure that, for example, things like heat pump installation, solar PV installation, and not only kind of the installation itself, but the kind of retrofitting and maintenance, these are all critical for decarbonising our buildings, but these have to be underpinned by proper training and routes to competence, which maybe we don't currently have. And I think that if you look at kind of the electrical trades across all levels, from fitters to senior engineers, that's going to be critical to make sure that we've got that skilled workforce. And again, think about smart grids, electric vehicle infrastructure, renewable integration, all of these key industry areas, they need to have recognised and industry agreed standards that inform qualification, development, assessments, training provision. Everything that is needed has to have those standards in the background.
Thanks, Phil. Right, just before we move on to the next question, thank you to everyone who's been sending through questions for the Q&A. Please do keep doing so. Claire, Ingenuity recently works in the engineering and manufacturing sector. So how do occupational standards in the engineering and manufacturing sector compare to employers' needs? Are there big changes ahead that need to be reflected?
Thank you, Corinne, and good afternoon, everyone. So at Ingenuity, what we found out from larger employers is they're telling us that when occupational standards were originally designed, they did meet their needs because they were involved in developing those standards. But as we've all said here, it's a fast-changing sector. Advanced manufacturing, engineering and manufacturing is fast-changing. So what that might mean is someone who does a job, then trains in an occupational competency, they might find that after 2 to 4 years, that job's changed. So they don't have the skills to do that job. So that is effectively an issue. And then if we compare that to SMEs are telling us that actually they want to be trained and to have quality and consistency and training in some traditional roles. So there's a bit of an issue there. When we say employers, we need to understand we've got those smaller employers and those larger employers, and they're asking for different things. And what we find is occupational standards are often not detailed enough, and they're lacking that those competency-based qualifications. And so within apprenticeships, for example, employers, those SME employers are telling us they just don't know what to train people on in the workplace. So that is a real issue. And we don't hear those concerns from SMEs and the devolved administrations. And there, they've obviously got the national occupational standards. So that's interesting. And I think there's a lesson in that as well. Now, in terms of change, what Ingenuity did is they actually, for IFATE, did a route review back in 2019, 2020. And out of that came a recommendation to include 20% flex in the occupational standards. Unfortunately, COVID then hit, so no action was taken on that. But the point about making that was 5 years ago, we were having this debate about we need flexibility within occupational standards. Another example I'd like to say in terms of SMEs is we do have some SMEs with quite specialist and really important sectors such as compressed air or metals. So what they ended up doing is designing standards because they need it for those skill sets, but then they can't get training providers to actually deliver them because they're saying the cohorts are too small. So that's a real issue. So they're important skills that go sector-wide in terms of compressed air and metals. So that, again, is pointing towards more of a modular approach where we've got that core, like quite a few people have been saying on the call here, and then you have those specialist niche skills, which can be built on top of that core. So, yeah, I think those are a few things from Ingenuity's perspectives and the different employers we've spoken to. We really need to strike that balance, hard as it is to do.
Thank you. And I think the SME point leads us on nicely to a question for you, Emily, from your work with businesses as part of the Chamber of Commerce. So getting SMEs involved is a challenge in a lot of fields. Generally, SMEs, people working are busy running a business and don't have time to engage with a lot of wider things. So how could we change that with regards to occupational standards?
Yeah, that is precisely the $1,000,000 question. I mean, we as Chambers of Commerce worked with businesses of all sectors and all sizes, obviously mirroring the demography of the region that we work with in the wider country. The majority of our members are micro and SME businesses, but across a wide range of sectors, doing a huge variety of things. What our research has kind of consistently found over the last few years, and probably going back before that as well, is that employers just don't understand the system. Like you say, employers are time poor, particularly SME employers, and don't necessarily have the resource and the kind of expertise internally to understand how the skills system works. And I say the skills system in the broadest sense because ultimately they don't necessarily think of it as T-levels and apprenticeships and university as all as separate entities. They think of it as the system that produces the skilled workforce that I need. It's also a really complicated system and a really difficult system to navigate, and we consistently, we work really closely with colleges and independent training providers across Greater Birmingham, and we're consistently working with them to help try and communicate and to help try and raise awareness amongst the employers that we work with, I say particularly those SMEs, about the opportunities out there. But the system, I think Donna worded it far more eloquently than I'm going to, but the system simultaneously doesn't change enough and changes too much. So it's, in some ways, it's sort of stuck where it was, occupational standards were started, and in other ways, it's changing too fast for employers who are trying to get their heads around it to feel like they can keep up. I think also, the number of standards that we have makes it feel ever more complicated, and the time it takes, where SMEs are looking to engage and they are really passionate about developing their people and developing talented individuals across the region. Where it takes a really long time to produce an occupational standard, that's not necessarily something that's feasible for them to get involved with and really get stuck into. And I think what Carmel touched on about using big data and thinking of, I guess, quite intelligent ways, technological ways to gather that information from businesses and to streamline the way that we get that information from SMEs. It's really interesting. It probably has a lot of potential because, businesses across all shapes and sizes have so many demands on their time, not only running the business, but then you've got, everything that they would love to do in their local community, whether it's providing work experience, whether it's, offering careers advice, whether it's getting involved with charities and social enterprises. And there's only so much time in the day, particularly when you're running a business. It's just so much to manage. So I think streamlining that process. And then finally, the other thing I'd say is making that offer to employers clearer. So the learning work report talks a bit about supporting and encouraging employers to make greater use of standards when it comes to things like job descriptions, thinking about workforce planning and developing their own non-accredited training. And I think that's a really interesting offer to employers in a sense of kind of what do they get out of investing their time in this? Because it's really difficult, particularly when the system's so complicated, it's really difficult to sort of summarize that in a way that's really engaging.
Thank you. So, looking through the questions we've got in, oh yeah, thank you for a reminder. So yes, please do keep sending questions using the Q&A function, and I can feed those to the panel. So we've had a few questions so far. There's one about the use of language in standards and whether there sort of is a common accepted way of phrasing things. And this is something that came up in our research, that although there have been moves in that direction for increased consistency, then there still do seem to be different ways of describing things across different standards, and some people involved in the development of standards in different sectors have highlighted how sort of similar skills have been described in a different way. Donna, I wonder if I could come to you on that and sort of whether there are any implications from your perspective in terms of a lack of consistency in how language is used, and whether you have any thoughts on how to move towards more consistent language.
Thank you. I think that's a really live challenge and probably has been live for a very long time. So very common core competencies like teamwork, that will show up in quite a number of standards, but the way the scales and outcomes are articulated across the standards, they are different. And the feedback we've had from educators is, well, I'm teaching on these two courses and, they both have teamwork, but your spec is saying something else here as against over here. And that is because we have got to map to the standards. And so you have got the challenge where a provider or a center has got to create different learning resources because the standards are different, even though they're inherently saying the same thing. They're articulated in different ways. And quite early on, what we did, particularly across the behaviors, was to sort of get a set of standards and look across the most popular standards and think, are they articulating the same behavior, but just in a very different way? And we created what we called our own behaviors framework internally, just trying to get some consistency. So when we embedded those behaviors into multiple qualifications and assessments, they were showing up in the same way. And that makes it easier from a center point of view and from a delivery point of view. And I know previous IFA, now Skills England, I know there was some work started probably about 2.5 years ago to try to bring some consistency, particularly around the behaviors in a very similar way, like I've just articulated. And I'm not sure where that got to, but it can be a real challenge because employers are in their own trailblazer groups and they're articulating it in the way they understand it. And if we're thinking about transferability of skills, where We know how jobs are going to be really, really fluid, not even in the future. They're already quite fluid, and people have got to think about how do I move from one job to the next. People are already struggling with articulating skills because we don't have that sort of normal conversations around skills. We talk about jobs, we talk about sectors, we talk about occupations, but we still don't talk about skills. So even when we talk about the skills challenge, we still talk about jobs in engineering and occupations and so, but we don't talk about what those precise skills are. And so having that overarching challenge, plus the challenge where we're talking about the same skills but articulated in a different way, is really making it hard for people to
Oh,
get to grips with what skills they've got. And so there is a level of consistency that we've got to get to pretty quickly. We're I think it says we're going towards a skills-based future. I think we're already in a skills-based future where the question is always, what skills have you got? What can you do? And we do need to give people the language to be able to articulate those skills, to be able to say, this is what I'm capable of. I am here now. I have got these skills, and I understand that I need these additional ones to make that transition from here to here. But we're still talking occupations, we're still talking sectors. And we need to get a little bit more granular and talk about missing skills and skills gap, not occupation and sector gaps, because we're still there. We do need to come down a little bit lower, I think.
thanks, Donna. And Carmel, I wonder if I could pass that to you and ask whether so we did come across some good examples in our research of efforts to make the language more consistent. Is there anything you can say about sort of any further sort of what's been done already or any further plans on that?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I echo what Donna said. Really important in this, what is a very complex system, and I'd probably use the word streamline. And I think this is work that sort of preceded Skills England, but we're continuing into Skills England. Uh, and it was just interesting what Donna said finally about the sort of granularity, because I think there's something about occupations. There is apprenticeships versus qualifications, and then there's the skills within each as well. So I think there's more we can do on the taxonomy. And I think as we start to revisit uh, the development of standards for both qualifications and apprenticeships, that we provide some all this stability in the terms that we use so that people understand them, whatever level they're working at, whether that's providers, awarding organisations, learners, employers. It is, I mean, I've just come out of a session this morning about assessment plans, and the language that we use in those is different depending on whether you're an awarding organisation or an employer. So I think there isn't a sort of a magic wand we can wave at this, but I think this is continuous work that if we're simplifying access to the skills system, we need to simplify how we describe it so that it's very clear whatever part you play in that system.
Thank you. Just before we move on to the next question, does anyone else have anything that they want to say on that point?
I would just add a point that as well as the issue of taxonomy and language needing to be consistent, I think there's also something that we could be doing to make the level of detail and how prescriptive standards are or aren't more consistent. Because I think if you compared them all side by side, you'd see that there are some standards that exist today which are very prescriptive and go into lots of detail around the knowledge, skills, and other things that have to be taught, and others where it's left more open. And you could argue that both have got their merits. And there might be areas where some roles do have to be left more generic or high level than others. But I think that's the other next step in trying to improve the system as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this point before we move on? No? Great. Okay, so we have a question here about sort of modular, flexible, stackable standards. And Claire, I wonder if I could come to you on this first, given you were talking about the sort of previous standards rapidly going out of date. So the question says that all roads appear to point towards the need for flexible, modular, and stackable standards. How could we move towards that and achieve the level of quality that's required to satisfy everyone with standards. And I guess from your perspective, would this be beneficial for employers who you work with?
Yeah, first of all, it would definitely be beneficial. I think in a fast changing environment such as engineering and manufacturing, so what with the large employers particularly are telling us they're having to reskill every 18 months. And as well as that, they've got the challenges of looking at forecasting new and future skills needs. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a need for it. It would definitely benefit. In terms of ideas, actually, Ingenuity worked with Skills Development Scotland to look at comparing using a data-driven approach versus bringing employees together to decide what they needed. And what they found as an output to that was that actually there wasn't much difference when they compared side by side. So that is pointing towards, can we use data-driven approaches much more? Because we've already got some evidence that that can work. We want to reduce the time on those employers as much as possible, but it needs to be quality. So I think there are other examples we've got closer to home than some of the international examples that we can look at to say, yeah, there are ways of doing this that have worked in some of the other devolved nations. So yeah, let's keep chatting and seeing and communicating and seeing what options there are out there. But yes, we need to look at all the tools we've got in the box to make this more streamlined for the benefit of everyone in the sector.
Thank you. And Carmel, I promise I won't keep coming to you after every question, but just on this point, are there any current thoughts within Skillsing and about sort of increasing flexibility or modularization of standards?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I very briefly mentioned at the beginning the foundation apprenticeships that have been developed. So some of those are now in delivery, and that's building upon the sort of knowledge and skills of the existing standard, but providing a foundation level approach. We're also working on a number of short courses, identifying where short courses, again, using the occupational standards, but this is more about sort of reskilling. So you may be in a sector, you don't need to do the full apprenticeship standard or the full standard to be an apprenticeship, but you might have some particular skills needed to help reskilling. So, I mean, the obvious one, which obviously we keep quoting, is around AI, cybersecurity, that short, sharp approach to upskilling somebody and then moving on. So those courses aren't yet in delivery. We're working through those in terms of identifying them, but there should be a number of those available from next year. So that's a couple of areas. Also looking in the qualification space, those of you who are familiar with higher technical qualifications, level 4, level 5, is looking to see where they might suit a more modular or flexible approach in the future as well.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this point before we move to the next question?
I'd just like to say a note of support actually for what Claire and Carmel have said, and I think that this idea of people being able to pick certain parts out of standards is critical. So for us, we work obviously across the power, gas, water and waste sectors, and there's a lot of transferable skills, lots of people who would want to be able to transition across different industry sectors, and employers don't necessarily want to have to train them on absolutely everything within a standard. But the idea of being able to pull modules from a standard and almost be able to say, okay, they're doing job A, they're doing job B. What does that delta look like? That's what we need to train them on in order for them to be competent. So that underpins the approach that we take when we come to develop occupational profiles and standards and supporting employers. Is that very much that modular approach?
And I'm certainly not an engineering sector expert, but as somebody who spent a lot of time in the qualification world, if there's a sector that it always faces challenge from a flexibility point of view, is engineering. We always have qualifications where the employers come back and say, oh, it's too rigid. We like all of this, but we'd like this and we'd like this. And so you find that engineering qualifications tend to have a lot of optional units because they need the flexibility. The move into mapping precisely to standards in the new world of technical qualifications, including HDQs, we have found it a little bit restrictive. And the sector that feeds back a lot on the inflexibility is engineering. So if there's ever a poster sector that we may want to try this with, I think it could be engineering. There is just so much so much commonality in terms of those core skills, but you've got things around the edges. And as I said, I'm not a sector expert, but just from looking across the different quals and looking at the units, there's just so much that is common. And you've got, based on the specialisms, varying units. But I do think if there was ever a pilot happening, probably engineering would be the sector to give it a go with.
Thanks, both. Any other thoughts on this point before we move on? No? Okay, great. So there's a question here about the how we use expertise on Trailblazer panels. And Stephen, I wonder if I could come to you first on this. So the question is, how important is a brief that we give to people on Trailblazers in terms of their expertise? Should they be briefed to be experts who shouldn't compromise on their expert beliefs, what they consider to be the best thing, or are they briefed to be experts who are coming together to come up with the best fit solution that will inevitably involve trade-offs and compromises? So I guess there'll be trade-off and compromises at some points. Do we want the experts on the panel to be the ones who are deciding that, or should they have a purer approach to it?
Yeah, so Ben, who's asked that, he and I have discussed this very question, so I feel almost prepped to answer. I mean, I think for me, it's the latter. We don't want sort of ideological purity to the exclusion of kind of getting stuff done. And I guess there's always a risk that the sorts of people who have volunteered their time, are able to volunteer their time to take part in those panels, are going to err on the side of this is the right thing to do. And you do need a bit of rigor. It's not, otherwise it's not worth the paper it's written on. But I think sort of don't let the best be the enemy of the good would be a good principle. It does link back a little bit to the previous question, and I think, Corinne, I've gone off piste and looked at the list of questions myself here. So I spotted that Annette has asked about how all the previous conversation, I think, links together with other programs like sector-based work academies and boot camps and connect to work and stuff like that. So you kind of got the standards, and I think you do need some rigor, but you shouldn't aim for ideological perfection because that way ruin lies. But then you've got what you do with them. And I think the slight worry at the moment is you've got just loads of stuff all over the place, and sometimes we've got solutions in search of a problem. So, foundation apprenticeships, I suspect are going to be incredibly low take up and do feel a little bit like a solution in search of a problem. Traineeships we've kind of gotten rid of because the take up was really low. I know colleges can do it through their mainstream budgets if they want, but there was kind of good principle there. But the idea of boot camps, short training, so 12 weeks or whatever it is, designed with employers, with an interview at the end. Foundation apprenticeships are meant to be sort of apprenticeships light, but kind of these employers paying people while they're kind of doing some training in a job. Sector-based work academies are meant to be people doing even shorter training designed by employers with a job guarantee, an interview at the end. These all kind of sound quite similar things, don't they? So actually, with skills moving back to the Department for Work and Pensions, where history aficionados of these things will know it was in the late 90s in a previous departmental structure. This gives an opportunity to rationalise these things together, particularly in a world where a report we had out last week showed how there's 1 million NEETs in this country. We've got to help those young people. So maybe we can have standards that have got the rigour, but are kind of, let's not aim for purity because we need to get stuff done and get employers using them as well. And then putting some of these programs together so they really genuinely reach young people in a joined up way that leads us to the outcome we want, which is a job with training and good earnings and a progression route. 2 questions for the price of 1, Corinne.
Thanks, Stephen. Does anyone else have any thoughts on either of those 2 points? Yep, Carmel.
I don't know how to put my hand up on this. Sorry, I've got so many screens open. But this comes back to the flexibility, doesn't it? I think it's, I go back to the question, which I think's moved, but I think if I recall the question, sort of the brief that we give to employers. But I think it's about there's a judgment across this, isn't it? That's the employer voice, how representative that is across sectors, also the deliverability aspects as well, the learner requirements. So I think there's a lot. I think as Skills England moves forward, it is building on that base of the employer voice, but also a wider remit of other stakeholders in the system. And I think it's that flexibility that comes to it. And I can't see the question now, but I think that if that sort of helps, just to, it goes back to the previous question where we were talking about flexibility. So there's the rigor, Stephen said, and then there's that flexibility that can sometimes come from a range of stakeholders, and therefore there will be trade-offs. But I think it's particularly for me is that word representative, whichever group we're seeking views from, it is representative as it can be, recognizing something very complex. And I think, as we mentioned before, asking one group of stakeholders and trying to get consensus can be quite difficult, and particularly when you're working with different levels, different sizes of organisation as well. Hopefully that helps. I'll try and find the put my hand up bit in a minute.
Thank you. Yes, I think that engagement of SMEs is a key point that came up quite a bit in the research, and we've sort of already covered that a little. But I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts on how to support engagement of SMEs so that it's not reliant on the views of larger employers who may not be as representative of the needs of smaller employers. Emily?
Yeah, I can certainly try and build on it further. I think, I mean, there's a few kind of wider things that can be done in order to support SMEs to better kind of articulate their needs and understand their needs as well. So when we did the research, going back a couple of years now, although we've repeated it annually since for the West Midlands and Warwickshire Local Skills Improvement Plan, one of the things that we consistently identified was that actually a lot of employers, and this is off the back of COVID-19, but it's come up in other research as well, a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises actually didn't have particularly long-term plans for business growth, and then as a result, long-term skills plans, succession planning, and things. So, with that in mind, it's quite difficult to ask an SME, well, what, in 3 years' time, by the time that we've developed the standard, implemented it, you've got a local provider delivering it in your area, what does that need to look like? Because actually the capacity and the expertise for that forward planning isn't necessarily available in the business. And that, comes down to a number of broader challenges, and one of the big things that in Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce and in British Chambers of Commerce we talked about this extensively as well, but is a big factor in that is the cost pressures put on businesses, and as a result the limited capacity that SMEs have, particularly given recent developments in things like national insurance contribution increases, employment rights bill implications, etc., coming down the line. So I think there's also an opportunity perhaps, and perhaps linking to the point about incentivizing SMEs or supporting SMEs to understand how and why they should get involved in informing things like occupational standards, in actually offering support to SMEs to understand themselves what their future talent needs will be or could be in 3, 5, 10 years. Because as Claire said, they are vastly different in many ways to the larger employers, and it's really important to distinguish those different voices and the different needs, but very difficult.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's just a few things Emily said that triggered me to respond to that, because yes, it's definitely something Ingenuity's found, that a lot of those SMEs do struggle to do that strategic workforce planning. We actually launched an initiative on Monday. I'll just give a quick plug because it is freely accessible to SMEs for 20 of them to trial strategic workforce planning tool that Ingenuity's produced for just that reason. Because we also did an SME snapshot survey, and that came back with them all saying, look, we're struggling to upskill, reskill, we're just struggling with all the other costs So part of it is, well, can we help give them a bit of that breathing space to really focus on what their needs may be? But almost they're so caught up in everything that's quite hard to do. And again, what incentives could we possibly give them to be involved in helping to design occupational standards going forward? But if they don't see the need because they're too stuck in what they're doing, then are we going to get them to be involved? So I think that's one thing. The other thing is obviously doing more to organisations such as ourselves and Phillips, just making sure we keep putting the energy and effort in to get groups of SMEs together so we can understand their views, because we know that can be difficult to do. We managed to get 150 responses for our SME snapshot survey, and we're planning to do that every 6 months. So we'll continue to do that so we can feed that back in to organisations such as Skills England.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from anyone else on this topic? Okay, well, it leads us nicely to another question someone sent in about employers. So, Emily, I wonder if I could come to you on this one to start with. So, whose responsibility is it, would you say, for employers to ensure employees understand the purpose and value of the products which come from the occupational standards, so qualifications, short courses, etc., so that they can plan and spend their training budgets accordingly?
Sorry, did you say you wanted to come to me on that one? It broke up slightly.
Yes, to you, yeah.
No worries. That is a really difficult question. I think it's got to be a sort of mutual conversation, and that's what we speak to firms about regularly. It's such a difficult landscape to navigate, but ultimately where firms are starting with the starting point of knowing what they want as the end result, having expertise within providers, whether that's colleges, independent training providers, adult education services, is absolutely crucial to helping them kind of understand how to get to that end result. Because actually sometimes we'll speak to employers who maybe think that they need a certain apprenticeship, or they think that they need a skills boot camp or whatever it might be, and actually having then had a conversation with a provider, realize that that's not quite right to meet the needs of what their kind of expectation is at the end. Equally, when we've surveyed businesses on whether they've engaged with the post-senior education training sector previously, and then if they have their experiences of doing so, the majority of employers in the West Midlands and Warwickshire haven't engaged with post-senior education training in the last 5 years, but those that have a really, really positive experience of doing so. So I'm not entirely sure where the responsibility lies, but I think it's something that as a region, between stakeholders, providers, and employers themselves, and to an extent individuals too, because ultimately often individuals are the individuals who are seeking training are the ones who are maybe identifying the training that's most of interest to them, most right for them, presenting the most opportunities for the business and their particular role. I think it's a collaborative effort.
Thank you. Carmel, you've got your hand up.
I have, but I think Donna might have been before me.
Oh, should we? Sorry,
I thought
should we
Donna
go
go
to
up, and then I realised I could work out with the hand. But I'm happy. Donna, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go
Yes,
first?
that's fine. I think it's fair to say it's the responsibility of the entire ecosystem. I think we all have parts to play. And from an awarding organization point of view, we are getting better in terms of articulating the purpose and outcomes of qualifications in a meaningful way. The awarding body sector can be very academic at times, and so when you look at a qualification, especially one that's in the technical and the vocational space, you do struggle to understand what is it saying, what are the outcomes, what are the learners being able to do. I think we are getting better in the technical and vocational space, but I think that's the role awarding organizations have got to play to ensure that they're actually talking to end users in a way that's meaningful for end users. So it's talking about what skills the going back to the skills conversation, what skills learners do have, what job roles they can get into. Employees do need to understand what value they're going to get from it in order to make the decision to spend. I think from another point of view is just generally the qualification system, and I know over the last 2 or 3 years we're moving to a new landscape where we're looking and IFA now Skills England has led on that in terms of articulating or naming qualification in the context of their purpose and making sure that there's that consistency. So that's the role of the landscape from a regulatory point of view. And then we've got standards that we talked about earlier. If they're not consistent and they're not transparent. So I think there are different players who have got different roles and responsibilities. It's not the role or the responsibility of any one person. I think we've got to work together to make it happen. And I think we've got to think about employers as end users, particularly with technical and vocational qualifications. And if they're end users, how do we speak to them so that they understand the value or what added value the qualification can add to their business? So I think there are multiple players who have all got a role to play in doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. So Carmel?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, just to build on Emily and Donna said, I mean, very much there are many actors in the system, aren't there? So it can't sit in one place. But it was a slightly broader point about the work that Skills England have previously IFA'd on the occupational maps, and the occupational maps have sort of set out information. So it's more of a communication point, set out how learners, students can move through different pathways, and that sets out the apprenticeships and the qualifications. And what we're looking to do is expand that in terms of setting out more clearly, that's my end goal. How do I get there and do the things that really will matter and will help me to get there? So sort of like a tube map type approach. So I think it's as well as sort of really articulating the purpose and value, it's also simplifying the information that's out there on how do you get there. So once you understand what it is, what's the best way for me to achieve that. So again, I think it just brings back that there's many different resources, there's many different people who input into this, whether you're delivering the system, articulating the system, or actually a learner or employer. So I think it's an all-encompassing, isn't it? But I think communications and communicating clearly, that's going back to the previous question about the skills. What are the skills that are needed? Can be quite difficult at first, but for people on the ground who need clear information and know that they're doing the most efficient thing possible, I think that's really important. And hopefully the work that we have contributed to on the occupational maps and the future work will help assist with that. And thank you for Donna talking about the naming of qualifications. This is a really tricky area to say on the tin what it does, and certainly part of this is more user testing, so that it is clear to people who benefit from this and those people who are benefiting from either the training or qualification or who provide it, that we do say on the tin what it does. And I think there's a lot more we can do in that space as well. Thanks, Corin.
Thank you. And Phil?
Yeah, thank you. I would support everything that's been said before me, and I think that for the kind of employers that we work with in the sector I work in, I think what it's been characterised is at the moment, a lot of the provision of training and qualifications is very supply-led, in that employers will be picking the thing that is either the closest or most convenient product to train their staff. But what you'd really want to move to is a more demand-led, where employers are able to say, this is what we need, and we want to be able to take, and to that earlier point about modular standards, we want to be able to take elements of a qualification or a program, because we don't need everything from it, and we want products that are focused really sharply on the kind of the skills and the knowledge that we want or we need our employers to be able to develop and demonstrate. And I think that's how you get them to, I suppose, take more appreciation of the value of those qualifications, that if it's really targeted at what they need and their demands.
Thank you. Any other points on this before we move on? Stephen?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of make because I think this is part of a broader picture as well, because actually the publicly funded bit of the skill system is quite small compared to what employers do overall. So employers spend about 50 billion a year on skills. The publicly funded bit of the system is about 5 billion, it's about 10%. And not all of that's going on in employer skills. It's kind of in community learning, all kinds of individual stuff as well. So clearly employers' responsibilities to meet their own skills needs, just as it is for them to meet their own capital needs or to do their own business strategies or to think about what product. One day I'm going to write a pamphlet arguing for that we should set up Tills England and that there should be a government agency that designs tills. And funds tills for shops, and then the shops can only pick those tills, and then all the retailers will say, "Well, these aren't the tills that we want, and we'll design them." And so obviously that would never happen because that would be silly. But then on the skills side, everything the whole debate gets boiled down to how do we get employers designing the publicly fund the 10% of the system so that they get what they want out of it. And we do need to do that so that it kind of adds some value, but employers have a responsibility beyond that. And in some cases, you need collective action at sectoral level or at regional level because there's benefits there, and the state can help enable some of that. And if we're going to put public funding into things, we want it to benefit individuals in the economy. And a good way to do that is to make sure it's helping employers along the way. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but we do need to recognise we're talking here about 10% of the system, really. And we need that other bit of the system. And employers are spending overall 37%. This allows me to plug another bit of L&W work on which there will be a future webinar, I'm sure. But employers are spending 37% less per employee on training than they were 20 years ago. And we need to change that. And we need to get the public and the private bits of the system working together so that we raise up investment in the two. But we often end up I know we're doing a thing on occupational standards, so this is a bit inevitable, but kind of seeing those links through to the wider system and what employers' responsibilities are and that wider picture, and making sure we don't overly focus or focus only on the 10% of the system is, I think, quite an important point overall. Just to widen out the ecosystem everyone was already saying was very broad.
Thanks, Stephen. And there was that sort of ties very neatly into a question about employer investment and whether in skills and whether better occupational standards might help increase employers' investment in skills, which I was going to move on to. So I think you've sort of partly considered that anyway. But does anyone have any thoughts on that? Phil, could I come to you on that? Whether you think that sort of better occupational standards might help boost employer investment?
I'm not sure it would necessarily boost the investment, because I think that investment is already there, driven by necessity especially for the very big employers. A large part of their ability to provide a sustainable service and a sustained service is that reliable workforce and the workforce planning, and so they invest in it. But that's not to say though that wouldn't be more effective through better occupational standards. So if you wanted to invest in skills, what you're looking for is more return on your investment. And if you are able to have more sight of the skills that someone will have from a role they're coming from, and you're then investing in retraining that staff into new roles, I think that's going to make you more confident as an employer to invest in that practice. If you think about people, transitioning between roles around natural gas to hydrogen gas, for example, I think if you have a clear line of sight as to what that difference between the skill sets looks like, you can invest more intelligently in transitioning staff between the two. And the speed at which people become a cost to the organisation and then become productive and profitable for them will get a lot quicker. And so I think that the more confidence that employers have the more effective that investment will become. I'm not sure it will kind of lead to increased investment though. Does that make sense?
That does, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah. Claire, you want to go first?
Yes, yeah, just moving on to that point, I agree that if there's more consistency in the language we use, then it would be clearer for employees to understand what does that mean by recruiting that person with that occupational standard, for example, and that will then help in terms of workforce planning. If we're looking at SMEs to play their part, they need help with workforce planning, but if we're looking for occupational standards to feed into that, it's important they understand the language of them and that they do have meaning. So I think there's something in that as well, and that potentially could drive more investment if we can understand the language and access the language and see how it transfers across.
Thank you. And Carmel?
Yeah, I wonder. I'm just like taking it broader than the occupational standard because there may be a relationship, but there's obviously many complex factors in that between that and increased investment. But I'm wondering whether it's also the products and the solutions that hang off the occupational standards more, so that as those solutions are devised, it may well draw elements of standards. So going back to that flexibility point, that if there is something that is valued as a product or a reskilling for some in some shape or form, that might lead more if that is valued rather than this pure standard itself. So I think it's the solutions that come off that. I mean, obviously we've turned the tide in the way we've always described standards as apprenticeships. There are a greater range of products now, but do they fit the bill? And I think if it's perhaps looking forward on that might help us to think about whether there is a more of a relationship between those products that may be shorter, sharper, smaller, that hang off the standards rather than the pure standard in itself.
Thank you. And Emily?
I was just going to agree really with everything everyone said. I think clearer language, enabling more business confidence in the product that they're investing in, looking at more modular products that are specific and quicker turnarounds businesses to potentially drive more investment. I think the other thing to add is that cost pressures 20 years ago were very different. I think business confidence 20 years ago, pre-2007, was incredibly different. And arguably hasn't recovered. And the businesses, particularly the SMEs that we're working with, in 2025 have extremely limited cash flow and have increased not just price pressures generally, but also very much increased labour costs, and labour costs are consistently over certainly the last few quarters, if not the last few years, the biggest factor driving up price increases in the firms that we work with. So it is an incredibly different environment. I think there's a lot of potential to increase investment around occupational standards and the way that the skill system is delivered. But I think also the government needs to look at the kind of underlying capacity for investment, whether that's in skills or capital expenditure across the board, and unlocking that.
Thank you. Any final points on this one? No? So, keeping an eye on time, we're rapidly coming to the end of the webinar, and we probably don't have time to go into another question in depth. So I wonder if we could move on to the final remarks from everyone. So sort of 30 seconds to a minute, final comments from each of you. Could we go to Donna? Could we come to you first, please?
Thank you. I think I would just emphasize what I've said previously. It's agility and fitness for purpose. And agility there is a part of speed and flexibility. But from an occupational standard point of view, that is absolutely where we need to be moving to if it's going to work, not just for qualifications, not just for apprenticeship, but for the skill system at large.
Thank you. And Stephen, can I come to you next?
Yeah, a couple of quick things. So first, fewer and faster. They should be our watchwords. We should look to halve the number of occupational standards and do them faster and set up some clear time limits so people know what's coming up and when. Second point, I think one that Philip made earlier about are some occupations really that different in England as opposed to Scotland, really? And actually, could we have a more common framework like I think we had 15 or so years ago, at least for some things where we've got national priorities? And then third point, where I think we need a bit more thinking, is that balance between flexibility and consistency. And things change, but also things need to stand the test of time. That needs a bit more thinking and maybe varies between occupations and sectors a bit as well.
Thanks, Stephen. And could I come to Phil next?
Yeah, okay. I think in terms of standards, what we just have to be working towards is developing things that not only are used in apprenticeships and that can sit on a shelf and be looked at, but things that will actually be used to make a practical difference to employers and workers. So standards that are going to be used to drive recruitment, training, professional development, and workforce transitioning. I think that all the points around agility and getting these produced and reviewed a lot quicker and more frequently would be a good thing. And a true four-nation system where there is consistency of standard and training, delivery, and funding, I think is pretty critical.
Thank you. And Claire next.
Yeah, I'll agree with all the other points that have been raised, but just want to stress the importance of the employers in all this and recognizing that large employers have different asks to those smaller S employers, and they can be at different points. Larger employers really need that flexibility. Things are changing quickly and fast, and we need to be able to upskill and reskill. And those small employers, they need to understand the skills system. We need to support them with that. We talked about the challenges, the cost challenges they're having, talked about workforce planning and reinforcing the fact that they want some consistency, they want rigor, and in some traditional roles, they want that detail because they feel that's been lost with the current occupational standard framework.
Thank you. And Emily next.
I fully agree with everything that's been said. I think from a SME perspective, there's some really interesting recommendations in the report. And I'm not sure if that's already been shared with those attending this webinar or if it will be shared afterwards. But broadly, I think making the system simpler to navigate, more stable, but with that flexibility that we've talked about, more streamlined and making the development of new occupational standards faster, with a much more clear ask and offer to employers to get involved in that process and to really use those standards as almost sort of a live offer presents a real opportunity.
Thank you. And Carmel, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Again, to agree with everything that's gone before, thank you. Really helpful insights from the report and from today. So really helpful to us as Skills England as we take this work forward. I think just probably I will slightly repeat what people were saying, but for me, it's sort of balancing that agility and flexibility for both the standards but the products themselves as well. How we get wider representation into the occupational standards development, into the consideration of future products and solutions. I think that's come through strongly today, and a system that responds at pace and recognises the challenges employers are working under day to day in trying to upskill people whilst facing the next set of changes and technological changes. And I think that all brings together in terms of that pace, agility and flexibility. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all the panel for taking part today and giving such detailed and considered answers. So that about wraps things up. I think, hang on, do we have a final slide to show? Yeah. Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining today. Special thank you again to Pearson for funding and supporting this work. To Hazel and Danny, my colleagues at L&W, for all their work on this project, and for Danny in particular for stepping in and covering all the presentation after technical difficulties, and for the panel for providing such a stimulating and useful discussion. It's been really interesting to hear about all of the challenges, where things align with what we found in our report, and the key issues we need to focus on going forward. We will share the recording with everyone who's registered to the webinar, and also the slides and a link to the report. If anyone's interested in joining our supporter network, then you'd be very welcome. There's details on the slide there of how to find out information about it and how to join. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.